Hello, today is Friday, December 1st, 2023. My name is Audrey McClure. I'm interviewing Acacia Coronado for the Voces Oral History Center at the University of Texas at Austin. Please know, Ms. Coronado, that this recorded interview will be placed in the Nettie Lee Benson Latin American Collection at the University of Texas at Austin. If there's anything you do not wish to answer or talk about, I will honor your wishes. Also, if there's something you want to talk about, please bring it up and we will talk about it. Because we're not conducting this interview in person, I need to record you consenting. So I'll ask you a series of 5 questions. Please say, yes, I agree, or no, I do not agree after each one. There are 2 questions we need to make sure you agree to before we go on. So first one, Voces wishes to archive your interview along with any other photographs and other documentation at the Benson Library at UT Austin. We will retain copyright of the interview and any other materials you donate to Voces. So the first question is, do you give Voces consent to archive your interview and your materials at the Benson Library?
Yes, I agree.
Second, do you grant Voces copyright over the interview and any material you provide?
Yes, I agree.
Okay. Third, do you agree to follow us? Do you agree to allow us to post this interview on the internet where it may be viewed by people around the world?
Yes, I agree.
Thank you. Okay. We have many questions in a pre-interview form that we have already filled out. We use that information from the pre-interview form to help in research. The entire form is kept in a secure Voces server. And before we send it to the Benson, we would have stripped out any contact information for yourself or family members. So that will not be part of your public file. Your public file will only be accessible at the Benson Library. So for our 4th question, do you wish for us to share the rest of your interview and your public file available to researchers at the Benson?
Yes, I agree.
Okay. And number 5, and last question, on occasion, Voces receives requests from journalists who wish to contact our interview subjects. We only deal with legitimate news outlets. Do you give consent for us to share your phone numbers or your email with journalists?
Yes, I agree.
Okay, thank you. All right, so again, this is going to be about your experience as a Latina journalist covering the Latino community. So my first question for you is, what was your first kind of impression of the pandemic? How did you first start learning about it?
I was finishing my last year of college. I had just done an early graduation and I was finishing my last fellowship. And so it was I distinctly remember the day that I learned that I had been accepted into Report for America and that I was going to get the job with the Associated Press, was the week that the pandemic really had started to gain traction in Austin. So I remember just thinking that I had no idea what my future was going to look like going into the workforce at the time of such uncertainty, and also just not knowing what that would look like for me as a reporter coming in and having to help record this very new part of history.
So tell me, like, how did the pandemic affect your work? And you're mentioning too that you didn't realize, like, or you didn't know like how it would affect your work in the beginning. So I guess also, like, when did you realize how serious the pandemic was getting or how it would be?
Yeah, absolutely. As an asthmatic, I very quickly was very afraid of how serious this was, especially once it was very clear that people with my kind of health conditions were at a very high risk of contracting a very serious level of COVID-19. I was very hyper aware of just the dangers that existed with that. My family lives here in Austin, and so all of my family is asthmatic as well. So it was a very immediate concern, not just in how I was going to go about my daily life, but also would I have to put myself at risk? And what would that mean? And if I did, could I see my family at that point? So it was, there was a lot of factors to consider, and there was a lot of factors that immediately came to mind. But I think the great majority of how serious it was really hit me when during this fellowship, I was helping to do coverage in the Matamoros migrant camps along the Texas-Mexico border, on the other side of Brownsville, right next to the bridge that is located in the Brownsville area. And so I distinctly remember going to the camps maybe a week before it was officially declared a pandemic in March of 2020. And so I remember going to the camps very unaware of how serious this was, and leaving having read a lot of updates on my phone as I was in there and thinking, am I safe? Should I have taken a mask? What is PPE? And I remember going into hospitals and going into medical tents and things like that, with no PPE just a week before, and then not knowing what that would mean for me, and not knowing if I had to accidentally put myself at risk, and also just being very concerned, seeing that reality, and then thinking, how is this going to impact them, and how is this going to impact the people that we're talking to? And it was a big reality shock.
How did you adjust? You were saying that, your family was also asthmatic. How did you adjust your work life to try to keep them safe? How did that affect like your relationship with them and how you interacted with them?
I was very, very blessed that when I started my job at the AP in June of 2020, they had a very strict policy to protect our health. So they would not send us out or put us at any form of risk unless a situation was extremely warranted. And even then, just massive precautions were taken all the time. So I worked from home mostly, and it was a very unique experience joining such a massive company. And learning how to navigate it all virtually. I have two coworkers here in Austin, and I actually did not meet them in person until January of 2021. So for a good like 6-7 months, we completely only knew each other by phone. And it was an interesting experience, but I think it also just helped all of us learn to communicate better. We learned to use our resources as best we could. We learned to make connections in different ways, and adapt using different mechanisms like social media, and we got really good at public information requests. Yeah, I think it was just a matter of learning how to navigate a new normal for us as reporters, and also just make really hard decisions about when a situation merited being in person, which at the time we were covering the pandemic, we were covering racial injustice protests, we were covering things leading up to the election that was coming up that year. And so I don't think that I ended up going in person to anything until about October of 2020, which was when we started doing more coverage around the election that was coming up. And I got sent to Houston, and I went to a few voting sites in Austin. And that was really the first like real human interaction that I had with the job since joining the AP. So I think I went from going back and forth and traveling all over with the Observer in like March to not really having to interact with people in person until like October.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you about that because I saw that you were covering like migrant camps before you started with APs, but clearly a lot of in-person interaction, a lot of, cross-border interaction. So how can you compare how that experience shaped your perception of how you were reporting when you joined the AP, having to still cover, migrant communities, having to still cover the pandemic, but not being able to do that in person?
Yeah, I mean, I think I was very blessed to have had such a long amount of time interacting with a lot of really great sources in that area beforehand. Because when the pandemic began and we couldn't be there in person and the bridges were shutting down, and we really just like, even if we wanted to, we had no way to enter the camps and we had no way to go into those areas. It became a lifeline for us. That's how we would communicate with people. We would be able to ask. There were essential workers who were going in and out. They were the only people who were allowed to cross, and they were the only people who were allowed to go in. And I think the months that we spent creating those trust relationships beforehand, before we even knew any of this was coming, became so essential in being able to have a way to communicate with the people who were directly involved. And we were people that they trusted because they knew that we'd been there before and we weren't parachuting in from other communities. And so I think they could tell at that point that we deeply cared and that if we could, we would be there as well. And so we were able to just use all of those bridges that we had built over such a long amount of time to establish points of communication, to ask people how they were doing, to understand how resources were coming in and out, and to have a more insight into those binational conversations that were happening about how to address the situation.
Can you give like an example of like a story where, you know, your previous connections and your previous work made a story happen that probably would have happened otherwise?
Yeah, I think there was some coverage that we did with the Texas Observer right before I was wrapping up my fellowship about a hospital that was being set up. And so the people who were in charge of that were people that I had made contact with in my previous visit to the camps a couple weeks before the pandemic was declared. And so when I went down there, I actually toured some of the medical aid centers that they'd set up, and I had gone around with them and talked to them about what they were doing and what their mission was. And I'd met a lot of them in person, and we went into a resource center that had been kind of turned into this hospital. And so when they declared the pandemic a few days after I left, I immediately got in touch with them and I asked them, you know, I don't know if I'm going to be allowed to cross anymore, and I don't know if I'm going to be allowed to be there in person, but you know, for future reference, can we just keep this line of communication going? Because I want to know what's happening, and I want to be able to check in and see how people are doing and how resources are being managed and what is happening. And so we were able to do some pretty long follow-up stories about just how medical supplies was allowed to go back and forth, what medical supplies was allowed to go back and forth, how they were getting access to it, what the policies were on both countries about what medical supplies was allowed to be brought into these areas. So it helped so much to be able to have that trust bridge built beforehand and for them to just know me in person at that point.
Did you ever face like any hostilities or backlash to your work, especially, you know, during 2020, there was quite a bit of backlash to scientific information, journalism in general. So can you tell me about that, how you managed it?
Yeah, I mean, as someone who has covered voting and has covered immigration and has covered racial injustice and women's issues, I get a lot of backlash and I get a lot of emails, and I think the first thing is my organization is very supportive. If there's at any point that I ever feel threatened, scared, concerned in any way, I immediately flag it to my superiors, and they just have a wonderful network of people to address that, and I don't have to worry. And that has only happened once where I've like really been concerned, and that time our company just immediately like made sure that everything was okay. And so yeah, I think the first thing is just like I'm very thankful to have a very supportive organization. And the second thing is just I have realized that if people are responding to our stories, they're reading them, and that's good. So whether they have something positive to say or something negative to say, if they are reading it and they are informing themselves, whatever reaction that might bring up, it at least means that they took in the information. And so I think I'm just grateful that people are at least reading it. And yes, some people have some hostile things to say, but I think that just shows that they are reacting to something, and that means that they absorbed it. So
Good perspective to have. I'm curious. So a big part, I'm assuming also like government reporter, AP, objectivity is a huge thing. And that is something that's just big in journalism in general. I'm curious, especially during the pandemic when there's so many, you know, disparate opinions being put out there, how do you navigate maintaining objectivity And what is objectivity to you as a reporter, especially in the beats that you're covering?
Yeah, I think objectivity to me looks like having an open mind. Because we are still humans and we still have experiences and we have pasts and we have presents and we have things that we are currently experiencing in our lives, and we have minds that are processing information, and obviously we're going to have opinions, but that doesn't mean that we're going to bring those opinions or those thoughts or those backgrounds into our reporting necessarily. And I think when it comes to situations that are tense, subjects that are controversial, the most important thing is to come in with an open mind to learning, hearing, and understanding everybody's perspective, and being willing to present those as fairly and as accurately as you can. And that doesn't mean that you're going to parrot somebody's misinformation. It means that if somebody has one viewpoint and another person has another, as long as you're not parroting something that is false, it is still fair to present those perspectives and allow people to draw whatever conclusions they want to draw from that. And I think to me, objectivity has always just looked like making sure that what you're presenting is still accurate, it is still factual, but it is still representative of the variety of communities that there may be, whether it is a community that reflects you or whether it is a community that reflects the opposite of you, and being fair to maintaining that balance. And also, I think allowing yourself to maintain that balance, because again, we are human and we come in with backgrounds and different perspectives. And it is important for us as well as humans to grow and learn and to open ourselves to new perspectives and hear from people that we usually wouldn't hear from. And I think my biggest rule of thumb is if I come in with an idea, trying to disprove that idea. And then if it gets proven in the process, that is one thing. But if in the process I can learn something about it and maybe prove something opposite, then that is also a win for me.
Another question that I had for you specifically was you're covering the Latino community during a time where there is obviously a lot of social disparities being emphasized that, were there before, but are getting exacerbated in a way that they weren't before. So I'm curious, like, how did your work covering the pandemic as a Latina journalist affect your understanding of health disparity as it relates to the Latina community? Or like, how did it affect your perspective of like these different disparities within that community as well?
Yeah, I mean, I think I grew up knowing a lot about how Latinos experience life because I grew up in a very predominantly Hispanic community. I am Hispanic, and I think like I witnessed a lot of disparities growing up, just from witnessing it with myself, witnessing it with my family. I have seen and endured racism and racial criticisms, and a lot of times just growing up seeing the ways in which family or friends who were of different socioeconomic levels or who were given certain opportunities over others, um, it was always very informative for me growing up to see how those disparities exist, and just to my parents always were very specific about making me very aware of them, to never take anything for granted, and also to just make sure that I knew that the world was not necessarily a rosy place where everybody gets treated equally, unfortunately. And so I think growing up with that awareness, it was not necessarily surprising to see how this was playing out during this global emergency. But I think it definitely just humbled me a lot, because having a job during the pandemic was in general very different than the opportunity that a lot of other people had. Having an income, having just the surety that I would have a roof over my head and food the next day was more than a lot of people had, and more than a lot of the communities that we were interviewing had. Knowing that I could have access to PPE, that I had health insurance and medical care, It was different than a lot of the people who we were interviewing who looked very much like myself, who looked very much like my parents, who looked very much like my family. And so it definitely was a very humbling experience and a very educative experience for me. And it really made me want to show that, because I thought, if this is having such an impact on me just as a reporter coming in and seeing this and learning myself this perspective, I would want that anybody who looks like me and anybody who looks completely different from me to also get that understanding and put themselves in the shoes of the people who are experiencing this in the way that I'm having this very unique opportunity to do. I think our jobs allow us to experience life through the eyes of very different communities and very similar communities to us. And that is such a wonderful opportunity. And I think the best that we can do with that is to try to get others to as well step into those roles.
I'm conscious of time. I want to ask you one more question, and then please feel free to cut it off if you need. But I'm curious, how did this experience, I mean, you talk about it with such emotion and such, depth of experience with it clearly. Did it energize you while you were working during pandemic for your job as a journalist, or were there times where it was also it was also very draining, I assume too. So overall, how did you come out on your job?
Yeah, I mean, it was a combination of draining and energizing. And I think only being in the moment, does that make sense? It it was truly a very stressful and a very scary and a very just eye-opening experience that at the same time taught us so much about humanity and about human interaction and about human issues, that it just gave us so much more to look at and so much more to look into and so much more to want to know and to have to ask ourselves and to have to ask society. And so I think in the same way that it truly burnt all of us out in so many ways, it also gave us so much more purpose to keep going, because it really showed us that there were so many more layers to society and to societal interactions on a political scale, on an environmental scale, on a health scale, on ethnic scale. It truly showed us that there was so much depth that was left to uncover, and it was our responsibility to ask all the questions that remain. And I don't know that that's anything we're gonna stop doing anytime soon. We have so much left from that. But it gave us a new purpose when everything seemed very dark and scary. And it also gave us a new opportunity to do something new and something more, even when I think we were all very, very, very tired and just really wanted a nap.
Thank you. Is there anything, I know we don't have much time, but is there anything else that you wanted to say or want to make sure was included in this that we haven't been able to cover?
I don't think so.
All right, well, then I'll end it here. I know you have to get going. So thank you again for sitting down for this and taking the time. I really appreciate it. If there's
Of
any
course.
questions or anyone you need to get in touch with, please just let me know, and we'll make sure.
Of course. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.